So I think I'm the only host on Top 10 who has never done an SCP video until now. I literally had to Google what it stood for. I really thought it'd be like scary creature, prison, not secure, contain, protect. Is that not slightly anticlimactic? I just feel like it is. Anyway, there are thousands of SCPs out there which you guys will probably know more of than me. The Foundation's goal is to contain any anomalies in the world, so humankind isn't threatened by any extra-dimensional, extraterrestrial, extraordinary force or being or entity. Basically, they contain any threat to humanity, and so we stand the SCP Foundation. What's up, you guys? Hope you're having an awesome day. I'm your host, Ayman Hassan, and welcome back to another video. How many people out there have been unlucky or lucky enough to see an SCP in real life? Lucky or unlucky really just depends on how you look at it, to be honest. Either way, enough of my rambling. These are the top 10 scary SCP sightings. Starting us off at number 10 is SCP Unknown. I don't even know which SCP this incident log is about, but all I know is that it's lethal and dangerous. So at some point in the 1900s, there was a containment breach of this unknown SCP, and so to protect themselves, a security guard, a doctor, and 2 Class D personnel shut themselves into SCP-555's containment locker. Now, if you don't know, Class D personnel are categorized as disposable people, and they're usually death row inmates that I use in experiments because they just gonna die already. Now, the 2 Class Ds then tried attacking the doctor and guard, but the guard shot one of them and its corpse immediately stuck to SCP-555's locker. Then, in an attempt to save the doctor from being attacked from the other Class D, the guard shot again, but he misfired, killing the doctor instead. His corpse also attached itself to the locker as well. Now, at this point, SCP-555's field went into geometric progression and pulled the dead bodies through the concrete walls. And the Foundation has no idea why SCP-555 attracts corpses to itself, it just does. And if you're wondering about the unknown SCP, 17 personnel disappeared after it got free, including everyone in the room with SCP-555. So I mean, make of it what you will. Coming in at number 9 is the Wipeout, also known as Incident Report 0788. Now, we don't know why, but for some reason Site-31 went into a complete lockdown with no communication in or out whatsoever. 3 months went by with no communication, no nothing, so the Foundation sent a group of armed personnel to override the lockdown. Now, when they entered Site-31, it was a horrific sight. All of the site's personnel were found dead, and autopsy results showed they had all died 2 months beforehand. Cause of death of every single person was a bullet in the heart, despite no bullets being recovered from any of the bodies. Now, when they found the body of Jacob Dillon, a researcher, they found him holding a Zeta 9 audio recording unit, and his cause of death was sudden and immediate brain trauma. Upon further investigation, files on SCP-4785 were found, and they described a catastrophic event where some cognito hazard affected all of Site-31. So I mean, the new personnel definitely didn't come into contact with this SCP, but the whole of Site-31 were wiped out because of it, so I mean, contain that shit. At number 8, we have SCP-2770. This SCP is kind of cute, to be honest, and it has 2 parts. So SCP-27701 is a seaborne anomaly and is basically a yellow life raft carrying a member of the British Royal Navy. The SCP will try its best to wait for a vessel and get rescued, and if it doesn't get their attention, it gets pulled the hell underwater, not to be seen again for another 124 hours. But if the vessel does notice him and does rescue him, then SCP-27702 will manifest, and this anomaly is an old rusty submarine. It'll manifest at the speed of light and pull 27701, the rescuing vessel, and itself into the water at a speed of over 200 kilometers an hour. So with that backstory being given, let's move on to Incident 2770C. Operation Kiddie Pool was initiated in order to capture SCP-27701 without 2 manifesting. So they tracked it to the coast of southern Norway and caught it within half an hour, and thankfully 2 did not manifest. A week later, with no sightings of 2, an agent started interrogating 1. Its name, it said, was Lieutenant Edward Rowling, and during the interrogation, when asked about 2, it says, "Oh, that thing." And after the agent probes him, he replies, "I think you forgot about the water table, you idiot." And then literally out of nowhere, SCP-27702 starts crowning through the floor of the room because it manifested through the water table under the ground. The hatch of the submarine opens and all communication was lost after that. GG. Filling our number 7 slot is SCP-4712. Now this one is actually crazy. So this SCP is a young male called Marius Elbescu, and his anomalous property is releasing dopamine and oxytocin in the people who interact with him. These people started feeling more energetic and happy around the SCP, but all that fades away when they're no longer in the SCP's line of vision. The first time the Foundation heard of this boy was back in September of 1946, when they heard about a 5-year-old boy that was appointed to a Communist Party committee. When Foundation members met the boy and realized he was only appointed because of his abilities, they took him and implanted a memory into that town. The memory was that SCP-4712 had died shortly after being born, when really it was just extracted. It was all a false memory. Despite being a fairly harmless SCP, it was the reason Event Alpha occurred and obliterated Site-07 completely. Now at number 6 is SCP-002. Now, so this SCP looks like an apartment, but it's not. It has an iron valve on the side of it, and when you open it up, every single object in there is made from biological substances made by a human body, like bone, hair, etc. There's DNA in each part of its makeup. But what happened when it was first discovered is utterly bizarre. SCP-002 was found in a crater located in Portugal by a local farmer. The man then told his village elders, and eventually the news reached the SCP Foundation because they sent a group of security personnel to secure and contain it. 3 men were sent in but disappeared upon entering, meaning this SCP was a lot more dangerous than it looked. To make sure no one else knew this, any witnesses were terminated by order of General Mulhausen like a true savage. During transportation, 4 personnel members were mysteriously drawn inside SCP-002 and also immediately vanished. Then upon further inspection, they found that the apartment had grown new furnishings, so my guesses are that every time this SCP consumes a person, they use them to grow or produce another furniture piece. And that is a crazy SCP sighting if I ever saw one. Coming in at number 5 is Video Log 174326, back when people called it a video log and not a vlog. So in the vlog, a doctor is just sitting at a desk peeling a kiwi, trying to get over his stress of working at the SCP Foundation and the experiments that he has to run. Then out of nowhere, he loses control of his hand and cuts his hand by mistake. As he's bleeding and in pain, you hear SCP-17433 full on lolling. Now SCP-1743 is essentially a sound stage that's made up of 3 subunits. 1 is a TV studio camera that records anytime the SCP is in an active state, 2 are humanoids that appear on stage, and 3 is pre-recorded laughter and applause. But the doctor then gets pissed at this random laughing and is like, what the hell are you laughing at? Why are you doing this? But SCP-17433 just ignores him till he's had enough. The doctor then grabs a handgun from his drawer but misfires and falls down. Again, SCP-17433 laughs, and the doctor's just so over it that he shoots himself in the mouth and dies. Now number 4 is SCP-4737. This one isn't even scary, it's actually quite cute. I just really wanted to include it. So this SCP is 2 objects designated as A and B. A is an adult side black top hat, and B is a glass monocle, and how it works is it has to make physical contact with a living animal, and the objects will shrink to fit the animal. Apparently the objects can make the animal smarter to the point of being culturally sophisticated. It was discovered in Malabuyok when an orphanage made a distress call to a local animal shelter, which was obviously intercepted by agents at the Foundation. Apparently the orphanage's dog was wearing the SCP and was now drinking tea with the children. When the agents finally got there, the dog was sitting there so eloquently and tipped the brim of its hat before going into the retrieval car by itself. Like, how cute, I can't even. Can I put this SCP on my own cat? I'd like to have tea with her. Filling our number 3 slot is SCP-4682. This one would actually be a menace for today's society because it really affects mental health. So this SCP is a silver glass mirror which is in an inactive state until someone stands in front of it and observes their own reflection. Now the mirror induces body dysmorphia in the individual, causing them to see the changes even in pictures and videos, yet no one else can see the deformities but the person. It was discovered in an apartment in Oklahoma when a man called the police reporting a missing resident. The resident was his girlfriend who lived in the apartment, and she was found dead in the apartment. All reflective surfaces in the apartment was smashed, all except SCP-4682. Now at number 2 is SCP-3935. The fallout from the discovery of this SCP affected a lot of people. Now, it was originally first seen in April of 1976 at Salvation High School. Anomalous activity started occurring at the school which led to a collapsed wall and floor that revealed a gap in the foundation of of the school. Now one of the janitors ended up finding the wall, and by this point it was big enough for a person to fit through it. Now when the contractors came to take a look, one of them fell into the antechamber near the SCP by accident, and instead of being saved, they were like, just go into the SCP a bit more, maybe there's an exit. A few minutes passed, then an hour, then 3, but the person never came back out. Freaking out, a search party of 11 people was sent into SCP-3935, but only 2 people returned alive to convey their findings. It was at this point the SCP Foundation became involved and took over the whole investigation. Anomalous activity started occurring all over the town of Salvation, to the point the town had to be fully evacuated, and a 2-kilometer quarantine zone was also put in and around SCP-3935 itself. The SCP itself is an extraspatial, extratemporal space which houses hazardous conditions, so much so that no one is allowed in except Class D personnel, and you know they're cannon fodder anyway. And finally, animal 1 is SCP-4677. So this SCP is this huge mass that has 72 tendrils coming off of it and 350 organic valves that kind of look like the mammary glands of a pig. Not my description, SCP's description. The whole thing is a cow deity from Norse mythology, but it calcified and turned into a 100-page document containing the original Coca-Cola formula. However, before that calcification, it caused a lot of harm at the Atlanta production plant where it was stored. Between 1918 and 1928, 26,000 people went missing, and so the team at Silo 18 decided to investigate. Coca-Cola was suspected of a cover-up, so the team visited the plant, but they weren't able to get in. Thankfully, 5 days later, a different team came and took over and interviewed Captain Jack Porrick. He claimed he came into the factory and all he could smell was the overwhelming stench of death. There were dead, mutilated bodies everywhere, and it was like a proper slaughterhouse. The captain heard some radio chatter or chanting sort of sound and followed it to find SCP-4677 before it calcified. The tentacles were out and it was killing everyone everywhere. There were at least 200 bodies just laying about. The entity would then eat the workers and then let out their body parts through its skin sacs, and it was truly awful. And that is it for today's video, guys. I really thought I'd never have to do an SCP video, and turns out I do. And this has scarred me for life. I don't think I actually ever needed to know more about SCP, and now I have, and now I regret it. So yeah, I've been your host, Eamon Hassan, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!